Hello, welcome again to the deep end. You know, we've tried to look at the deeper side of everything, those processes, those things, those openings that life can't do without, that consciousness can't do without. And one of the things that keeps coming up in all of our lives is fear. What is the deeper side of fear? Now, for those of you who followed our podcast, you know, when I went on to the Bible, the Garden of Eden, I think most people miss what's really going on in the Bible. If you look what's going on, it starts at the Garden of Eden, where we wake up to our death, and we wake up to the fact that what makes us live is good, and what makes us die is bad. We wake up to fear. We become conscious. And the whole journey of the Bible, in my mind, in my understanding, is from fear to love. How do we go from this garden and then create a city that's an analog of that, that's consciousness made, that still reflects that? So today we're going to go the deeper side of fear. You know, and we can talk about fear, you know, the neurology of it, and this and that. We could talk about FDR's very wise saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And if we look at what the ego's job really is, it really is to keep the organism secure. And so fear is something that has to be managed by the ego. And the way that is done is sometimes so off the mark. We become afraid of this and that, and we manage those, and the ego thinks it's in charge because it can manage all those this and that's. But there's a deeper fear underneath it all, and the word that most reflects it is angst. You see, angst is the fear of nothing. It's not anxiety necessarily, because anxiety is usually connected to something. Angst is not connected to anything other than the fact that you're going to die, your mortality. It's sometimes called this part of the human being called the forever nothing. It's where we send the biggest troops of our psychic being, and we put them at security at the door of the forever nothing, because we do not want to experience that. Whatever we do. Angst is a flavor of fear that is underneath it all. And the thing about it is we can run from the forever nothing. And where we run is into everyday doings. We get caught up in busyness instead of beingness. It's interesting, I came upon a poem by Truman Cooper. Suppose that you have fear, and that your fear could be trapped and held in Paris. Then you would have the courage to go everywhere in the world, all the directions of the compass open to you, except the degrees, east or west, or true north, that lead to Paris. Still, you wouldn't dare put your toes smack dab on the city limit line. You're not really willing to stand on a mountainside miles away and watch the Paris lights come up at night. And just to be on the safe side, you decide to stay completely out of France. But then danger seems too close, even to those boundaries, and you feel the timid part of you covering the whole globe again. You need the kind of friend who learns your secret and says, "See Paris first." You see, we're kind of trapped in this place between fear and love, aren't we? Between this angst and love. Heidegger talks about what we do to master angst is we direct that into certain moods of fear. See, I wonder sometimes if civilization and consciousness hasn't gotten too close to its own forever nothing, and so now we're creating moods of fear across the planet. Because there's this part of us we don't really want to get close to, because it's very, very anxiety producing. It creates huge conflicts in the soul. And what we do is we create all these conflicts in the world, in my mind, that keep us from the forever nothing. So much of our everyday lives is a defense against this forever nothing that I'm talking about. It's a distraction from our own mortality, our own death, our own underlying uselessness of it all. Again, it gets back to metaphysics. Why anything at all? And we have to somehow live in that. Again, we need the kind of friends that say, visit Paris first. You see, there's this deeper truth that the ego has a very difficult time in owning. And that deeper truth is, there is no security. I think that's why I like the Moody Blues, especially when I listen to Justin Hayward, and he talks about what he loves most is uncertain future. That's exactly what most of us fear. How do we dance in that? How do we somehow accept our mortality? How do we open ourselves to the deeper truth that we might truly be free? And I don't think we're ever going to be free unless we enter that room of the forever nothing. And it really is painful to enter that room. And yet, it also gives wings. And here is the journey to me between fear and love. We have to embrace the very thing that scares us most. And that doesn't mean, when I talk about distractions, that doesn't mean we don't do stuff. My gosh, yes. But you're doing, I pray, is going to be more in line with who you are and what you are. And not to appease some part of your soul or some part of the world. Fear, angst. And I'm saying now from the deep end that angst is the deeper side of fear. And much of what we do fear, we create in order to keep us distracted from that forever nothing that is so painful and yet is truly the place that calls us all together as one human people. I just laid out a whole different context. I used Heidegger, I used Freud and Jung, I used a number of theologians, but I also believe that this is our journey. And mine is sincere, and so are my cohorts. So, Marianne, I'll start with you. The deeper side of fear, what say you to start us off?
Well, I think you just started us off very, very deeply. Talk about going deep into the deep end, because I'm not quite sure what more I can add other than I would say that fear will control us until we identify it. And I think that's something that, and you just said what our deepest fears are. And it's interesting because this last week I was just having a conversation with someone about the fear of death. And they looked at me and they said, my deepest fear is not my own death, but the death of those I love. And I think that's that angst that permeates all of us, because there are people that are in our lives that when they're gone, we have to still continue on. And so there's that fear of losing that. And then also there is our own nothingness, our own, why are we here? Why are we striving? Why are we doing any of this? And I think that we have this fear that and honestly, I think every single person is dealing with fear in some way, on some level. And what do we do with it? So we have to identify it, and then we have to live in spite of it. And that's where our choice comes in. That's where we make those decisions to love instead, to trust instead, and be afraid, but do it anyway. So I guess that's what I would.
And as you were speaking, there's a Hebrew prayer that actually was in the end of the serial Godless, where the preacher says, there is no greater fear than loving that which death can touch. Right. And I think that that's very true, and that ties in to our own deep mortality, and all those fears in my mind are one. So Bob, what say you as we begin this conversation?
Well, I'm going to suggest that it's even more complex than that.
Really, Bob? I'm surprised.
Oh, I think, yeah.
Fear, fear can have so many different faces. Many of them we don't even recognize because our ego or our unconscious overlays that fear with something else. Too often it's anger because the fact just to our mortality, but to our concept of ourself. And fear of shame is maybe one of the most potent types of fear, maybe even more so than fear of death, because some people will overcome fear of death in order to avoid fear of shame. And just like there's many different types of love, the Greeks said, you know, famous three types, and brotherly love, you know, and so forth. And there are so many types of fear that I think it would be great if, as Marianne says, we could confront it all the time. But sometimes it's difficult to confront because our self-concept doesn't allow us to identify it as fear. So we act out in ways that we really don't have control over.
Yeah.
And if we can stop our anger sometimes and say, well, what am I really angry about? And dive a little deeper into that, perhaps then we can see where it really stems from some type of fear.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're talking about there is you're breaking up for me, so I'm going to cut in here a little bit. What you're talking about is displaced fear. And that's why I say if we can get to the deeper side of our fear, which is the fear of nothingness, then we can start seeing those fears without being so threatened by them. We can begin to see them undisguised, if you will, because I think what you were saying is we disguise our fears and you know, a lot of the time in the clothing of anger because we're not understanding the deeper piece that's going on. So I think that fear blossoms, and many times we're unable to articulate that fear, and our inability creates a backwash that creates another layer of fear. And I think that's where the complexity comes in, is trying to sort those out. And my point is, I don't think we'll ever sort them out. I think we can enlighten ourselves by talking about them and elucidating them and creating stories from them, but that the real freedom is in opening that doorway to forever nothing, getting all the defenses out of the way and walking in there. And that sucks.
Well, you know, I think our task is to sort them out, and I think that they do get complex, and the idea that fear of shame, and so again, synchronicity happened for me this week. I happened to was watching a talk by Brandon Burchard, and he ended up going into some ideas around fear. And one of them was loss, that we're afraid we're going to lose something. And that's our face, our dignity, and so that's where I think that shame comes in.
Yeah.
We're going to lose a job, we're going to lose our livelihood. The other one was that if we teach things, it's going to be hard to face your mortality. It's going to be hard to do whatever it is you're trying to do because you just don't want to have to work that hard. The other one is that we're afraid that things are going to be, they're not going to turn out anyway, you know, so why even bother at all? And so it's kind of like, it is complex, it is multi-layered, but how do we live in spite of it? And so how do we live with fear without having fear run our lives? So that's kind of where I go with all of this.
Yeah.
Give me some
ideas. Or how can we use fear as a tool to help us move forward?
Yeah, we have to run away from the tiger, right? We have to be afraid
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
tiger. So
Okay,
yeah.
now we're back to Bob's balance. And I think, as y'all were talking, come to John Bradshaw's work of healing the shame that binds you, and how powerful shaming is, and yet how important it is for us to have some sense of shame. And that balance there. And I think that over and over, and you all have both said it, fear's not going away. All it can do is may help us to become more honest and authentic. We're not creating and displacing it and disguising it and doing different things with it, but we're owning it and letting it do what it needs to do. People who say, I have a lot of pastors who say anger is bad and it's evil. And I said, yeah, well, tell that to Jesus in the temple. And I go, oh, but don't tell it too loudly because you might get yourself crucified like it got him crucified, and you don't want that now, do you? It's over and over. We forget there's a place for anger. There's a place for our fear and our hurt to say enough. I'm not going to sit in the back of the freaking bus anymore. There's just a point, and I think that's where we're trying to come to over and over in the journey of the human family, from fear to love.
Yeah, and we talked last week about what is our purpose, and I said at the time that the journey is a learning experience, and what could be more important to learn than how to deal with what's going on within ourselves, and that's how do you deal with fear? How do you deal with love? It's
well, and I wonder if there's an analog between authenticity. You only can be as authentic with your love as you are with your angst and your fear. And I'll be honest. I'll confess it. My whole life, there's been this deep tremble of fear that I didn't know what it was. And then of course it's called, in adolescence, they got a whole lot of names for it, and then anxiety and this and that. But it's not anxiety, it's angst. It's the forever nothing of which I've come out of and I will go back into.
Yeah.
And I think when we live our lives, we need to be brave, right? But that's different than bravado. So when you squash those fears, when you don't recognize them, when you don't face them, then you exhibit bravado, where I'm going to just deny that it exists. Yeah. Where bravery is you see it, you recognize it, and then you act anyway.
Well, you hear soldiers talk about fear on the battlefield and how heroism is not doing away with fear. It's acting in spite of it, and that may be part of the learning experience too. We're never going to get rid of it, but we have to learn to move forward toward
Amen.
And avoid those pitfalls like anger.
And it goes back to the original meaning of the word courage, which is a French word which means large heart. It doesn't mean that you're not afraid. It means you have the whole picture in your mind as big as you can, and you hold it there and you act from that, no matter what your feelings might be. And I think that piece of the human soul is paramount in the journey, especially as it relates to owning our own nothingness. And it's not a fun place to visit. And yet, for me, the more I visit that place, of course, I'm getting older. It's kind of a forced deal at this point. The older I get, the more I see that when you oscillate in and out of that place, just as oscillating in and out of the center, the quality of one's life is improved in such a way that finer nuances are brought out, more colors, more depth of field, more distinctiveness, more human, more understanding and compassion. So there's a yield to me in this facing our fears or our forever nothing, if you will.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. The idea of the depth that we go to, because when you're living with, we have to keep living in spite of our fears, or we don't. That's our choice. We can cocoon ourselves. We cannot do anything. We can stagnate. We don't have to face those fears. But if we don't, we're going to suffer more. And I think you make a good point. It could.
Okay, can you say that last piece again? Because you cut out, Marianne.
I was going to say, if we do step into that, our life can expand in ways we never even imagined. Our fear is crippling, or it can be.
And you just talked about the two ways to die. If you don't move forward, you die. I mean, you're just stagnant. And if you do move forward, well, you might die. Go ahead, Bob.
Yes. Well, there's to make it even more complicated, there's a thing called the general adaptation syndrome, which is the body's physiological reaction to fear. And it's there not just when the tiger attacks, but also when we're experiencing angst or shame or whatever. And all of those things that come with that syndrome are things like increased acid in your
oh dear,
stomach, leading to ulcers. The businessman that fears not getting a contract is going to develop an ulcer because of it. So again, it's how you deal with it, both mentally and physically.
Right, or a parent in a hospital room with their child. I mean, what happens physiologically in those high stress situations can have a taxing toll, but the fear is real. And so how do you mitigate it? How do you take care of yourself when you are trying to make these decisions and do these things?
And avoid communicating that fear to the child.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
And also, the interesting thing is the fears are most authentic that I've ever seen in hospitals. In other words, you have every right to be afraid. You're afraid of the right thing. Freud said civilization created neurosis. In other words, we started being afraid of all those things that, we're going to get the business deal. It was no longer a snake or a stick that we had to discern between. It was stuff that was... it's still, so sometimes on sports days, I look at the fans and go, do they really know this is a game?
Well, and I think you're right about when you're in those situations where fear is the appropriate response. But I think what we tend to do is try to minimize that fear rather than identify that fear. And so if we can identify what it is we're afraid of and speak honestly about it, then it doesn't have to control all of our actions.
And now we're back, and now we're back to authenticity, because what you just said, Marianne, is genuine fear really creates growth, creativity, new abilities to respond, new understandings. It's all those, what did Jung say? Neurosis is a substitute for genuine suffering. How do we allow ourselves to be afraid of what is worthy of our fear, that it might move us to a new way of understanding and a new being that is greater in its understanding of wholeness and health. And I come back to that over and over because I think that that's the metric we're trying to find for the human family.
Well, amen to that. I mean, it's just...
I love it.
Yeah. I think, the other thing, too, that when I'm working with my own fears, and trust me, I've got tons of them. When I'm trying to number one, identify what is the real fear, and then how do I move forward anyway? And one of those techniques, or one of those things that we can do, is to have that higher purpose, have that higher goal. So if I want to step out of my house, but I'm afraid that I'm going to get a virus, what is the higher thing that can make me do that anyway? Well, I need to go to the store. I have to get food to feed my family. I have to do whatever it is. And that's a very, very small, insignificant little, well, I guess it's not really insignificant for some people, but it's a very small thing when you're looking at the overall fear of death and the overall fear of losing loved ones. And I guess that all boils into that. So how do we create our lives in a way that we are looking at love rather than the fear? So,
Yeah.
and to me, love is that higher place of what is it we want to accomplish? What's our goal that is going to be beneficial for all? Whereas fear is going to keep us restricted.
Yeah, and the word anxiety really means constricted. Angina, it's a constricted artery. I think that one of the things that you said that's got my mind moving to a next kind of context is that how important a higher context is, and that the journey we're on is always moving us to higher orders of understanding. I kept thinking as you were talking about the way an electron moves from one orbit to the other and it doesn't pass in the space between, and that we're moving ourselves into higher orbits of understanding, and it gives us a way to look at things anew and to create new language to even talk about some things, whether it's computer language or bio language, that we might have a deeper understanding. And so as part of what I see as a concluding thing is that it really is about facing our fears in such a way that, one, clarifies the fear so you know whether it's a real fear or if it's a neurotic fear. If it's neurotic, you're probably a pattern and you'll pick it up after you are honest on a few fronts. If it's a real fear, then how do you engage it in such a way that it doesn't translate into anger or self-pity or any of those things, but actually has a higher yield? But my point here is that authenticity creates a greater soul that's growing and that, to me, is creative. We're coming up against our time limit. Marianne, final comments on the deeper side of fear?
Well, I think that, it's identifying that fear and identifying what it is within ourselves that we value and living towards our values rather than out of our fears. So I think that would be, lashing out is a form of fear, because when we lash out at others, it's because we're afraid of something. And so if we can get a handle on what it is we're afraid of, we can start to be kinder, gentler people, maybe.
Amen. Bob, final comments on fear and the deeper side of this whole trembling issue?
Well, I think that the thing we have to avoid is being discouraged. We have to realize that we can't just flip a switch and get rid of all of our fears. It's a lifelong process. And we just have to ensure that we're moving in the right direction, that we're striving to be more understanding of ourselves and of others. And don't give up. Keep moving forward.
I'm with you on that. That is, yeah, don't give up.
Yeah, me too.
My view is if you're breathing, man, you're still on the journey, so keep at it. And we're all trying to get to know this fear. There's a whole slew of people. You know, my kid, they love horror movies. What the hell? No way. I don't need that. And yet, they're so popular. It's just amazing. We're trying to get to know fear. Why? Because I think as consciousness is concerned, the human family, we're trying to get out from under it. We want to love each other. We don't want to be haunted by that stuff. You know, and this is where we started, isn't it? The Garden of Eden to Revelations, the city of God. That there's this journey trying to go on, that consciousness is somehow trying to analog the very complexity that is nature, that gives rise to this balance that is life and consciousness. We're trying to reflect that. We're trying to move in accord with it. And it's been a hell of a journey, and I say hell with all of its implications. Suffering, and I even talked today about we create moods of fear. I wonder if half the wars we've started are just about trying to keep us from who we are. That forever nothing, I don't know. But it's a trip. It's a trip, and that's where we're going next time. My friends, may the blessings of the one be on you, and may in all things you return the touch.